Hi, I'm Roshaan Ranasinghe. Welcome to Timeline, a weekly look at the key economic news stories in Sri Lanka. My guests and I will be discussing what the latest developments mean for the country and for you and me. In the studio with me today is Sriyan de Silva Wijeyeratne. Hi, Sriyan.
Hello, Roshaan.
Current chairman of Axion Solutions, a software and digital consultancy. He was also the president of the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society. Also with us is Bram Nicholas. Hi, Bram.
Hi, Roshaan.
The Chief Operating Officer at ETIS Lanka, a provider of economic training and information services. The big news this week is on debt. Is there light at the end of the tunnel for Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process? Also, a Canadian bank is suing the Sri Lankan government. What does that all mean to us? On a positive note, Sri Lanka's March manufacturing indicators showed a blip, or was that the start of a turnaround? So let's talk about the debt restructuring process. Last week, Japan, India and France set up a common platform to address the debt restructuring program, but China stayed away. Bram, I'll come to you first. What are your thoughts on the latest developments? How are you seeing this?
The way I see this is really sort of this playing out in a way that it was always going to play out, where restructuring needs to happen. And the different parties coming together. But for me, it's really important to start discussing from Sri Lanka's point of view, going forward, how they're going to repay their creditors. And I think that is still very much missing in the discussion, because I always give the example of if you were to go as an individual to a bank. Now, what the bank is mainly interested in, they're trying to decide whether they're going to give you a loan, is how are you going to repay it? How are you going to meet your monthly or annual payments? And you come with your proof of income or whatever. Now, in Sri Lanka's case, that has never been convincing to me, because here I draw a very sharp distinction between domestic debt and foreign debt. Both require money to pay off, but very important is that distinction where you need dollars to pay off one and rupees to pay off another. In Sri Lanka's case, it's clear where the problem was. It was the foreign debt, not the domestic debt. The foreign debt was defaulted on because the government ran out of dollars. So for me, the essential question here is, how is the government planning to get into place a strategy where in the future Sri Lanka finally has a sustainable source of foreign exchange earnings, pay off the current debt, but also no doubt future debt.
Okay, that's interesting. You speak about being a good borrower. You're not implemented some of the solutions that required to be implemented. As a result, our debt credibility and profile has suffered. Before I come to Sriyan, a quick follow-up on some of the key creditors that we have to pay back. Particularly India, Japan and France have come to an agreement, but China is kind of the view that multilateral debt has also got to be restructured. I mean, is that going to derail the entire process? How are you seeing it?
Yeah, I think they have a point in some way, because throughout this whole discussion, I think most people have assumed that the bilateral private creditors, the commercial debt basically, was a lost cause, because you're dealing with all these private individuals, or actually mostly private banks. And then it's very difficult to get a consensus there, and it usually also doesn't happen, which is incidentally why a lot of countries that have, let's say, not experienced the same type of crises that Sri Lanka is currently experiencing, they have stayed clear from commercial debt. And in fact, that was that article, Roshaan, I think you also read it. Yeah. We were trying to make this point where it's not just the fundamentals I was talking about before, but also the structure of Sri Lanka's external debt, because there are different forms, and the commercial debt that has been built up, particularly the ISBs, of course, those were always going to be problematic if there was any restructuring that had to take place. So yes, I understand what China is saying, but it's going to be very difficult to get all these private banks to agree. But then I think China's other problem is they, unlike most of the other countries, have lent far more to developing countries and will then have to answer to them why they are willing to.
Absolutely. So talking about the challenges, Sriyan, in terms of bringing what Bram is saying in terms of debt restructuring, you with your exposure in the corporate sector, how is that playing into day-to-day business and taking a long view of that?
It's if you roll it back, China was initially also worried about this whole process. It flagged it from a couple of different angles. China felt that the multilaterals don't really represent a fair view. It's a westernized view. Those institutions need a rehaul, and therefore those agendas are getting pushed through in conversations like this. They said we want a better, fair, transparent conversation on some of this. Understandable. But China also felt that didn't have confidence from the outset in Sri Lanka's own plans. And China said, hey, we are not too sure that you are really going to be able to do this and deliver on this, and therefore we'd like to understand more. And that's like mentioned earlier, I also think China had a point. Somebody's coming for the 17th time, right, borrowing money and saying, please, forget all the commitments we've made and, we'll start again and here's the new plan. So Sri Lanka has always lacked a national agenda on these things of going forward. It's always been a political agenda. And the moment you get a get out of jail free card, you're back to, creating these monstrosity projects. And I think the last decade and a half, where we saw this huge ISB borrowing trend, they figured out that this is the smartest way to, create projects and definitely make money with less regulations and controls. So obviously you go up to 40-50% of those kind of debt for a nation. Now, what do you expect? Yeah. So China is wondering whether we have the discipline to actually stay the course before they put their hand up and say, we are still willing to support you. I think it was great that we got to this level. We convinced these other parties. I think China will play through. Okay. It will come at a price. It will come at some pain, but I think it will work itself out. But I think it was good that Sri Lanka at least got to this stage, sure, because that helps the businesses start thinking that there's going to be some light at the end of the tunnel. But my worry is also that this is creating a pseudo sense of normalcy. And I sometimes wonder whether we deserve more chaos before we came out of it, so that we might make more lasting changes, right? Okay, interesting. All because right. If you look at, some of the changes in the past that Sri Lanka has put its hand up to, institutional reforms like, let's say, privatizing Sri Lankan Airlines, right? You did it, you got out of jail and back you went. And, some of these things, we've always not followed through on structural reforms. So I think businesses will like the, pseudo sense of normalcy and some visible hope. But I personally think we are far from, getting there. And I would still remain extremely worried and alert, nimble and hungry.
Interesting, yes, because if we have a foot in the door in kind of restructuring, but we need to kind of really explore it more and also have sustained effort into restructuring some of these things.
Have you also, and Roshaan, have you guys seen these interviews of Yanis Varoufakis, yes, the former finance minister? Yeah, that's right. Because what you were just saying suddenly reminded me of, he was also dealing with a similar situation with the Greek debt crisis in 2012. And he was basically also making the point that, there was this friction between the European Union and China. Both were involved in, let's say, involved in the Greek economy in some way. China had actually invested quite a bit in the ports there and were also involved. And he was trying to really get out of this crisis deals that would contribute to basically Greece's production. You know, he was really trying to, in that way, change something fundamentally, whereas he got the idea that the European Union just was out there to grab whatever they could, and then, you know, they call it basically the same as they're doing now here, which is fiscal consolidation and all of the rest of that, but nobody is actually talking about production or anything like that.
Correct. Some kind of reforms that are needed to course correct is not happening.
Exactly. And so that was his frustration. And he also said actually that, you know, even though he acknowledged completely that the Chinese are out there for themselves, which is what every country in principle is doing, but that doesn't mean that they're not, you know, open to discussion. Trying to get that done, but it was just, I don't know if it was ideological or that the EU felt threatened somehow that China was getting too close with Greece's ports. But he always felt like more could have been done there.
You're listening to Timeline. I'm Roshaan Ranasinghe with my guests this week are Sriyan de Silva Wijeyeratne and Bram Nicholas. Moving on to some of the kind of joining features of the restructuring process. A Canadian bank is suing Sri Lankan government. Sriyan, what are your thoughts here? I mean, they want full face value, 250 million back. I mean, how is that going to derail? Or, I mean, there's a lot of confusion and complexity here.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure we're going to shed too much extra light on that. But if you look at the context, I mean, this was almost a preemptive strike launched, you know, last year when you could see where the country was heading. And I thought it was like an anticipatory step that somebody seemed to be taking. Now, Sri Lanka at that time objected, and, you know, the last court case which went against us was really on the issue of whether the bank had the right to even represent the party involved. And so it really didn't even get to the meat of the issue. So I think we are far from done on this. I think these are like two parallel tracks which will play out. There's no case of, you know, one being sorted out for the other. They're in motion. What I do sense is if one of them gets too far ahead. So for example, let's say lots of institutional reforms, IMF, etc., all this journey starts moving, then I think the bank at some point might say, let me also fall in line and, you know, move with everybody else who's moving along a journey. Whereas if a court case were to set a precedent and we've not moved far enough, then we run the risk that you would unravel quite a few things for the country. So I think you need to keep an eye on that. But I think putting our head down and getting this sorted out, what we can control, because now a ball is in play, right? But where I see controls is that typically Sri Lankans, in dealing with these issues, it's been seen as an extension of politicians and their cronies and, you know, getting someone, you know, to kind of even fight a case on your behalf. There's been a lack of clarity on what our stance is on the domestic debt restructuring.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it may seem that we've even said that we are going to do that as either in parallel or preceding some of these. Now, we were told that, you know, the strategy on restructuring will be announced before the end of April. So we are dangerously close, as always, to these timelines, and we are still clear on what the game plan the government is having. And quite often we've seen, like we see in the current news, which has also dominated the headlines on the Express Pearl, and whether Sri Lanka's best interests are being served, and it's clearly not. Sri Lanka to take years and, you know, keep submissions on the last days, and they did that the last time round as well. When the cutoffs were coming, they submitted just on the day after you had a year or two or what to submit your, interest. So will Sri Lanka's interests be fought for aggressively, or will someone compromise that for their personal gain and, you know, give Sri Lanka to the dogs and feed us to the wolves? And how hard are they fighting on the nation's behalf and on behalf of wildlife versus self-interest? I mean, here the whole concern is really for the marine species and the environment and the fishermen and all of that, not that somebody in the middle can walk off with a chunk of money. Institutional savings and all do get messed around with. That is going to cause a lot of challenge. But it's not without precedent. There have been international restructurings and processes like this, where countries have at first round said we will not touch it, and then very quickly come back with a round two saying, oops, this is not enough for us, and we will have to tinker around with these institutional debts that we excluded from the first round of conversation. And to that extent, I'm sure business will be carefully watching some of this, because they will have to factor some of this when they start looking at it. And on the other hand, if you keep businesses in limbo for too long on this, there's a risk that they will factor these risks into their pricing, into their strategies, all of that, and artificially either raise prices, flee the country, shift industries, delay investment decisions. So you don't want lack of clarity either. Businesses prefer to know the bad news early, and they'll figure out how to deal with it, give them clarity. So I think there is a need for decisive clarity on some of this, and I think that would ease some of these issues.
I think that's a very key point that you bring in terms of providing clarity to the business community, in terms of, as you mentioned, in order to make some of the investment decisions, what the progress is and what kind of decision the central bank or the government is going to take. That will kind of, again, have ripple effects down the line. And that kind of moves on to our third area that we would like to discuss is, you would have seen in March, kind of manufacturing and services indices went up. I'll start with you, Bram. In terms of these indices, particularly manufacturing, is that a key representation of a turnaround in the economy, or is the manufacturing index not a heavyweight in the overall turnaround of the economy?
Roshaan, I feel like I keep disappointing you with my answers. I'm going to do it again probably, but in my job I have to do quite a bit of an analysis on these economic indicators. And when I looked at Sri Lanka's manufacturing PMI, and I actually look at manufacturing PMIs for most of the major economies in the world, it has never really made sense to me. I do a lot of cross-checking. So in the case of China, for instance, I saw that a lot of the official data wasn't really useful. And there, actually, in contrast, the manufacturing PMI gave me a better idea of what was happening in the economy. Here, it seems almost the other way around, where when I look at the industrial production index, that often gives me more of a clue in terms of trends than the manufacturing PMI. I don't know, I just, what's coming out from that is really bad. Basically, we're looking at a contraction with data going up to February that is as bad as the 2020 contraction when production was basically ceased for a few months. And so, that looks really bad, and now we see export growth turning down as well. So those two indicators are probably two of the most important for me.
Sure.
And that really shows that the industrial sector in Sri Lanka is incredibly weak at the moment. And now this downturn in exports has me particularly worried. But in fact, it makes sense if you look at the global context of this building recession in the global economy. And that, sorry for digressing a bit, but that also brings me to something I think is not paid enough attention to, is everyone is so focused on the domestic policies and the IMF policies right now that no one is looking at the global economy. And we have this massive recession coming. Even the IMF acknowledges it, which I find strange because it's nowhere to be found in their policy recommendations. But anyway, coming back to your thing, where what then worries me is that I see quite a few optimistic forecasts on Sri Lanka's GDP rebounding, foreign exchange reserves rebounding, And I'm thinking, where is all of that supposed to come from? Because the assumptions are that tourism will bounce back to, some stability, some stable level it was before, and that exports will, return, and that. But even if it does,
do you have a sense of a time frame for the currently what you see?
in terms of the global economy or the Sri Lankan?
Sri Lankan economy impacted by domestic as well as global conditions.
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at the global economy right now, we're seeing several economic indicators for the major advanced economies that are as bad as they were in 2008. Okay, right. So that really signals to me that a recession is pretty imminent for most of them. Now, frustrates me as well is that a lot of people have been drawing a distinction between sort of the short-term firefighting policies and then the long-term, and been saying, right, we'll deal with this first and then worry about the long-term later. First of all, I've only been here a year, but my understanding is this has been said in Sri Lanka for decades now. We'll worry about the long-term later. Of imports again. So
absolutely. That's interesting that you bring the kind of global context in terms of our manufacturing declining, I think, for the past 4 to 5 months, I believe. Sriyan, I'll come to you on that from particularly bringing up on Bram's point of exports reducing and also the global environment not too conducive to growth and all this points. How are you seeing that mix and playing into the Sri Lankan context?
Yeah, I think it's spot on. So let's scroll back a little, and if you zoom out, I think we are banking on tourism. That's fine. It's okay. But on the other fronts, we are really having a skill gap. Right? There's a national skill gap, and this crisis is just pushing all kinds of skilled resources out of the country. So it's going to be a very slow, if not impossible, burn to fix the skill gap issue that Sri Lanka is facing. So, in economic terms, and I'm sitting next to the master, but our production possibility curve is going to shift. There is no chance of being able to produce the quantums at the abilities that we had a couple of years ago because we are missing a couple of the critical resources. In an entire manufacturing equation, you're missing the financial muscle, you're having markets declining because we were Western oriented, especially on apparel and things like that, and then your factors of production like labor, smart people, etc. is shrinking by the minute, right? Now, there's absolutely no plan that I have heard of, even of a whim of bringing in foreign talent into the country to replace any of the talent that we're losing. We will just beat our egos up and say, we are smart, we are able, it's a great country, and stop short of doing what needs to be done. Yeah. I'm very worried about where this optimal level of manufacturing and things that we will be able to do will land, and that will impact, how fast we will move in the coming years. And certainly the last, couple of decades post-independence, we're a lot more inward-oriented in our thinking, and even fooling ourselves into a delusional level of thinking we can be self-sufficient in so many things, and time after time after time we found that is not the case. So while you're doing more of import liberalization and essentially also allowing some of the manufacturing entities to get the raw materials and things they need to manufacture, it's also going to become a question of what are your export target markets. And we are probably going to be far better off to target this region, the Vietnams, the Indias, and say, how do we make a play in the countries which are probably going to grow, and we have, proximity to, etc., rather than think that we can make a comeback into the declining, challenged economies in the West and expect better results than what we had a couple of years ago. So my guess is we are looking at a 4-5 year very tough run. What I'm worried about is that we are not building plans on we should be out of the woods in fairly quick time, and then let's get on with things. So I'm frankly concerned that if we don't get the right fundamental plans going now on the base set of assumptions, that we will prolong our recovery period as businesses and as a nation.
Sriyan, what frustrates me as well is that a lot of people have been drawing a distinction between sort of the short-term firefighting policies and then the long-term, and been saying, right, we'll deal with this first and then worry about the long-term later. First of all, I've only been here a year, but my understanding is this has been said in Sri Lanka for decades.
As you mentioned, we've gone to the IMF 16 times before, and if you look at some of the conversations they're having, is reform state sector enterprises, come up with a good anti-corruption bill, make sure your inflation is within the target range, make sure that you don't excessively print money. So I mean, common themes across the 16 arrangements. With that, we wrap up for this week. Thank you to my guests, Sriyan de Silva Wijeyeratne and Bram Nicholas. Timeline will be back next week to look at the big talking points in the Sri Lankan economy. Until then, from me, Roshaan Ranasinghe, thank you and goodbye.